Okay, everybody. Can you click?
Oh, yeah, click.
Okay, so we're gonna get started with this little graph that's like my favorite graph that I always like to talk about. I saw it in one of my classes and it had, I don't know, it was very impactful for me at least, so I wanted to share it with you all. Basically it's just like a little bit just to get you started thinking about like why we're here. Um, as you can probably tell, like the darker the color gets, the higher the global temperature is and like the worse climate change is going to be. And the part that really makes you mad or sad or angry or whatever the emotion it is like the people who are born in 1950 and who are like were 70 in 2020 have like a very light colored person. Like they're not really going to feel the effects of climate change that much. And then there's our generation, or like, I mean, I guess we were born a little earlier, but like the people born in 2020 are really going to feel the effects of climate change when they're only like 70. And so just something for us all to remember, that like climate change isn't something that's in the future or that's like going to happen to, future generations. Like it's going to happen to us. And that's why we need to do something about it right now.
Okay, so this is our grounding framework for the evening. Who has heard of this before? Okay. So this is the Just Transition Framework. It was popularized by Movement Generation and Climate Justice Alliance. These are two really amazing groups in Oakland, California. But basically, it details how we are currently functioning in an extractive economy. And if you look at some of these different parts, the purpose of our current economy is to enclose wealth and power. We do that through the means of exploiting work and exploiting relationships with Mother Earth. And the governance form we take in order to gain those resources is through militarism. And resources, again, we extract, we dig them up, we burn them, and we dump them, and we find new ones. And so the way that we are able to maintain this is through a deep culture of consumerism and a colonial mindset that allows us to think that these things are okay. And so Just Transition details how do we get away from this system that we exist in the West to a living economy, which really tries to prioritize cooperation, looking to ecological and social well-being as the purpose of why we're here on this earth, and then also looking at governance in forms of deep democracy. Deep democracy is basically community members and citizens get to work with their government to decide what happens versus what we kind of have, which is a fake democracy, which is we don't have a lot of say in what actually happens in many realities of our society, and then looking at regenerative resources. So this is a bit of a closer look on some of it's called the values filter, but you'll see some of these components are democratizing wealth in the workplace, shifting economic control to communities, and then advancing ecological restoration. So kind of building the new, investing in our power, and then divesting from the harmful things. I do want to point out, this also is brought up a lot when you talk about Just Transition. If you Google it, this will come up. A lot of organizations use this. This is not inherently a just transition. Clean renewable energy does not automatically give us those things. You have to think about all those other components. Do we as citizens have power in the decisions? Are we focusing on regeneration and collective well-being? So this is you.
Thank you. All right, so before we get into the nitty gritty, I'm just going to provide some context for Washington state policy relating to environmental justice. So first, the Inflation Reduction Act, probably the most well-known. This is not Washington specific. It's federal legislation, but it's probably the most important climate legislation to date. Passed in 2022, this act is basically to provide funds to climate solutions and also to focus on American energy security. So the main aims of this are to reduce energy expenses for households and businesses, generate manufacturing employment opportunities for American workers, and pave the way for a clean, secure, and healthy future for upcoming generations. So it's kind of focusing on economic gain and how we can make a green transition economically viable, and focusing on creating jobs through renewable energy transition. And thinking about how this can apply to UW, specifically the IRA as a source of funding. So 33% of IRA funding goes towards clean electricity tax credits, which applies to higher education institutions such as a university. So that means that it can benefit campuses' energy transitions and subsidize clean energy efforts. Also, there's direct loans and grant funding available to apply for clean energy projects, and also supports alternative vehicle fuels. So there's incentives to offset EV charging installation, electric vehicles, and credits to subsidize the purchase of electric vehicles. Okay, next, this is Washington specific. This is the Healthy Environment for All Act, or the HEAL Act. And this was passed in 2021, and it was the first statewide environmental justice specific act. It defined environmental justice, it created an environmental justice council, and basically the main goal of this act is to eradicate health disparities in Washington state, environmental health disparities. And it really works at the government level, so it targets Washington state government agencies and requiring them to implement environmental justice framework into their work. So it's important to understand why the HEAL Act was passed and the importance of it in Washington state. So this chart at the bottom shows how vulnerability is a multiplier for threat when it comes to environmental hazard and risk. So it lists different threats, so fossil fuel pollution exposures, as well as other toxic exposures, and then vulnerability, so socioeconomic factors and sensitive populations, and how that equates to an increased risk for environmental hazard. So what the HEAL Act does is it acknowledges that low-income and BIPOC communities are at a disproportionate rate of pollution and environmental hazard, and then aims to address those inequities. Thank you. So this graph at the bottom shows the environmental health disparities across Washington state, and this is actually a part of the HEAL Act. The government is required to maintain this map. It's available to the public, and it just shows by county the influence. And part of the HEAL Act, obviously, it is specifically targeting prioritizing vulnerable communities and eradicating environmental health hazard for those communities specifically, but it also aims to work with those communities. So incorporating community engagement plans and tribal consultation framework. And then next is the Climate Commitment Act, which is a very important act for Washington state. It sets the goal to reduce carbon emissions to 45% by 2030 and by 95% by 2050. And so to apply this to UW, we are a state institution, are expected to comply with these greenhouse gas emission reductions. And the goals of this act are climate equity, holding big emitters accountable, and then also funding climate projects. And the way that this works is through a cap and invest program, where basically the government sets allowances for pollution and then sells them in a quarterly auction. So typically one allowance is equivalent to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide pollution. And then this is sold, and for institutions, corporations to pollute, they are expected to purchase these. And then throughout time, the amount of allowances sold will decrease, and then that will influence the reduction of emissions. But in the meantime, that relates to the second part of invest. So all this money that's being earned from allowances is then going to be invested into climate solutions and an energy transition. So the goal is that in the sense of a just transition, that while we're transitioning to clean energy in a more green future, we'll also be creating the infrastructure, investing in infrastructure that's expected to aid in that in the meantime while emissions are being reduced. So the specifics of environmental justice investments under the Climate Commitment Act are separated in this chart. So a minimum of 35% of the funding is required to go towards vulnerable communities specifically. And this is the minimum, but the target is 40%. And the budget is posted online. And for this year, for 2024, it is proposed that 41% of the budget will go towards vulnerable communities. And then an additional 10% is required to go towards tribal projects. And then also in relation to the HEAL Act, any agency that's receiving funding from this act is required to submit a report of their environmental justice progress to the Environmental Justice Council. And then relating this back to UW and how UW can get funding from the Climate Commitment Act, it really is focused for projects that support clean energy transition, ecosystem resilience, carbon sequestration. So there's already specifically funds allocated towards UW, which includes $7.5 million directed towards the Washington Clean Energy Test Beds at UW. The background picture of this is the building, the W27 building being built. That's specifically for research, including clean energy research, and that's where test beds will be implemented. And then 263,000 is going to build on federal funding for the UW Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center. And this funding is meant to assist overburdened communities and tribes to allow them to access national funding as well as state funding that's being allocated towards environmental justice. And the University of Washington can also request funding from the Climate Commitment Act. So currently in this legislative session, UW is requesting $48.9 million from DCA funds for 6 decarbonization projects across all campuses. And then for UW Seattle specifically, that includes centralized chilled water capacity improvements, Clean Energy Institute, and medical center HVAC removal, and centralized utilities.
Sweet. Okay, so now that we've got kind of that overview and that framework, I want to bring the scope down and really look at what is happening right here on campus. So this is decarbonization at uw.edu. Breaking news, UW operates a fossil fuel burning power plant. It's right out that window. This is a bad thing. The reason it's a bad thing is because it accounts for the majority of UW's Scope 1 emissions. We define that by being emissions that UW is directly responsible for. So the things that are coming out of that smokestack, we've got a wonderful mixture of particulate matter, methane, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and twice the national average of nitrous oxides. That's a sign that our equipment is aging and that we've got to do something about this. To put into perspective the carbon equivalent that we're emitting, imagine you get in your Ford F-150 truck. You drive on an imaginary road that goes around Earth and you're going 70 miles an hour. You'd have to drive for 393 years nonstop to release the same amount of carbon that that smokestack releases a year. That is data. We've got links to that at the end, but it's just a staggering number. The distance you would have traveled in that time would take you from Earth to the moon 1,050 times. Do you want to do the thing? Hey, there we go. Okay, so we're right here. We're at the hub, right in the center. The lightning bolt is going to strike where the power plant is. You can see it's on central campus. Everything that's going into the atmosphere from that power plant is affecting all of us right here, right now. And here's kind of a zoomed in scope of this monster we're talking about here. Okay, so what is the plan? The good news is that UW does have a 5-step decarbonization plan. One of the main components to that plan is taking the power plant right now, which combusts primarily methane gas to create heat, to then go and the steam goes in pipes underground to most of campus's buildings and heats up the buildings. Instead, we want to replace it with newer technology. It's called a heat pump. And a heat pump essentially works by using electricity to take ambient heat that's already in the air and compress it so that then we can send it. So we're no longer combusting. We're no longer releasing emissions. All of the electricity is going to come from Seattle City Light. And like 99% of that electricity is hydropower. So we're not releasing carbon emissions. We're not putting it in somebody else's backyard. That's accounted for. And the great thing about this technology is on average, heat pumps take about 65% less energy input to do the same function. So it's going to be a lot more efficient. If you're curious more about these specific steps, we've got at the end an additional resources that's got like a link to an hour-long video that really documents each step in particular. Okay, so now I want to pass it on so you can hear why you should care about all this.
All right, why should you care? UW fossil fuel emissions obviously contribute to a much more large-scale issue, that being the climate crisis. But why should it matter to you specifically that UW transition to clean energy? And would that transition impact you as an individual? The answer is yes, and I'm about to tell you why. The emissions from the UW power plant cause health issues that are a lot scarier than you might think. The plant is run mostly on natural gas, which, if you don't know, is a fossil fuel that requires hydraulic fracturing or fracking for its removal and usage. It also emits mass amounts of methane as well as a myriad of other greenhouse gases. The health impacts caused by this include higher risks of childhood cancers, endocrine disruption, respiratory complications, and heat-related deaths. And actually, the emissions from the plant contribute an amount to global warming that is the equivalent of causing 22 heat-related deaths per year. The statistic about heat-related deaths is one that is only going to rise as global warming intensifies, and that is why we need a transition to clean energy. That starts with our campus.
Okay. So another implication of climate change and reason that we should care about curbing carbon emissions, especially at UW, is that climate change is increasingly straining global economies in an asymmetric way. Recent estimates have said that anywhere between $5 to $29 trillion have been lost due to anthropogenically increased temperatures, just 1 degree Celsius. And we can see from this graph, does this have a laser pointer? Yes. We can see from this graph that the majority of this burden is carried by lower economic or lower affluent countries that also have lower emissions compared to higher affluent countries like the United States, which have large emissions and face a more negligible or have typically faced a more negligible economic downturn. It's estimated that 68 to 135 million people will be pushed into poverty by 2030, which is a staggering number. But importantly, that number is going to, again, be disproportionately represented by lower affluent countries, and that's going to sort of play in and perpetuate the economic burden in these countries and the inequalities that they're faced with. Too far. Part of the reason that these countries are more susceptible and more vulnerable to climate change is because in poor economies, economic output is more directly reliant on a productive environment and a resilient environment, such as like clean and safe access to water, agricultural yields, and a robust forestry. And so when you have anthropogenic perturbations to these environments, there's more dire consequences than in richer countries. It's also important to realize that the relationship between temperature increase and climate change repercussions is a nonlinear relationship that, a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase and a 2 degrees Celsius increase result in entirely different realities of outcomes. And so it's really important that we sort of curb carbon emissions best that we can and sort of contain temperature increase to whatever 1/10 of a degree that we possibly can, because that next 1/10 of a degree really means entirely different ballpark of outcomes. A quick aside is that I found this statistic recently that 3.6 billion people are already living in highly susceptible areas, which was sort of really profound and surprising to me. That's, nearly half of the people on this planet are already living in highly susceptible areas. And then the death rate in these areas is 15 times higher than in, more affluent countries, more northern latitude countries. And that sort of also plays into the idea that, economic burdens, health impacts, and climate change are all distinct issues, but they sort of exist in a reciprocal relationship where they sort of feed back into each other and exacerbate both each other and inequalities within and between countries. A little plug here is, I think this article is fascinating. Mostly very sad and very powerful, but it's called The Climate Warming from the Cradle of Civilization. If you haven't used your New York Times subscription, it's free for UW. I would use it if nonetheless, but to read this article, it's where I got both this quote and this photo from. Definitely will induce a little bit of climate depression, but I think it's worth it in this case. All right, and then to kind of end my portion of this talk, to bring the discussion to a more local perspective, we've talked, or I've just talked about how these impacts are going, or disproportionately felt by poorer nations, but richer countries like the United States is not immune from these repercussions. And this was a infographic released by King County in 2017. And so some of the health, economic, and environmental impacts we've already talked about are directly mentioned on this infographic. And so we're going to see in Seattle, increased number of heat-related mortality events, financial burdens due to like drought and agricultural yield diminishes and whatnot. And then again, like in the global perspective, these issues will be more acutely perceived by more vulnerable populations, such as those that don't have access to infrastructure to escape heat, or those that are financially constrained, like broke college students who can't afford the rise in consumer prices and whatnot. So, yeah.
Okay, and the last reason that you should care is because you have the power. Student voices can be a driving force for universities. Universities can be a driving force for broader climate work. We can be the roots of that work. The small proportion of students on this campus who are already involved in climate work and climate groups have already made such an impact. So imagine what we could do with more student support.
Okay, so in that spirit, we're going to talk now about what our club, ICA, which is Institutional Climate Action, some of the action that we've taken and the change that we've made. But first, before I start talking about this, I want y'all to talk to each other. Imagine there's some change that you want to make at UW, and I'm sure there's something that you would like to change. How would you do it? What would be some things you would try? It doesn't have to be it would work, but what are some avenues that you would at least try to start out making change? And we'll come back in a minute. And I'm looking for people to share out after you talk. So
library, which is what I'm trying to do.
oh my gosh, Abby, you were good.
Some stuff and then ramble and
Yeah.
sound really nice, which that's what I was afraid of. So I just
You did good. You did good.
Yeah, yeah. Jillian is a rat. It's called like a.
Yeah.
My college government. We talked to the
Okay, wrap up your thoughts. I know it's not very long. Sorry. Okay, can I get some hands? Any ideas? No pressure. They don't have to be anything crazy. Yeah.
Our group started talking about convincing people and maybe getting some petitions to show that people are interested in it. So give people to find something.
Sorry, can you what? Oh, petitions. Yeah, for sure, for sure. Thanks. Yeah, back there.
My name is Gabriel. I want to say thank y'all for putting this on and this opportunity. One thing I would like to change is more sustainable development on campus through the buildings and of course electrification, and that can lead to also helping with intersectional issues such as homelessness and things like that.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have any ideas of how you could start making that change to more sustainable buildings?
Absolutely. Well, step one is collaboration and partnering with y'all. I'm a part of Net Impact. I'm a director of outreach for them, a business sustainability club. And so I would say that step one is communication and collaboration with different groups. And then step two is pushing administration to make these priorities through our collective voices.
Oh my gosh, I love it. That was a great answer. Yeah, collaboration and using our power as a collective student body. Okay, I'll take one more. Yeah.
Organizing actions, expecting university officials to demand that they divest from fossil fuels or from that produce weapons.
Totally. Oh my gosh, you guys are hitting all the points. So yeah, no, they were planted. Yeah, talking to university officials and just trying to get them to divest, all that kind of thing. Okay, so ICA, we have some goals, still have, I guess, some goals. But we were thinking it was back in winter quarter last year. We wanted obviously UW to be sustainable and more sustainable. And so our goal was that they have a 95% reduction in scope 1 emissions by 2035. So scope 1 emissions are just only focusing on the things that we actually can bust here on campus. And we talked to a lot of people, and we figured out like, okay, probably the fastest feasible timeline is 95% by 2035. And we also wanted students like y'all and like faculty to know more about this issue. And then in addition, we wanted to acknowledge that like UW is not the most accessible campus, and that during the like power plant transition that Gabriel was telling you all about, there's going to be a lot of campuses going to be ripped up to replace pipes underground. And during that process, we can build back a better, more accessible campus for students here at UW. So some of the things we tried to get this happening, our first thought was like, maybe let's go talk to UW facilities. They're the one who are doing this transformation. Like, let's see what they have to say. So we joined the Energy Transformation Student Task Force, and it was good. We got to talk to David Woodson, who's actually here in the room back there, the director of the Energy Transformation. We got a lot of great information, and we had some really good discussions. Unfortunately, it wasn't the place for us to enact our change, just because David Woodson is not like the final say on this. He does not decide how fast we decarbonize. And in the end, it's President Kassé who does. So we had to kind of look other places for ways to change. And so that brought us to, how can we like persuade President Kassé and the Board of Regents to do what we want? And so President Kassé is one of the decision makers here at UW. The Board of Regents is another one. They're kind of like this group of people. I think they're chosen by the state. Don't quote me on that. But they have a lot of power in deciding what happens at UW, including how fast we decarbonize. And so we thought we were trying to like brainstorm ways that we could sort of change their opinion on this, because originally they were very resistant to pushing the decarbonization timeline faster. We gave them public comment where we just like talked to them. That doesn't really change their minds that much usually. We thought about writing legislation, putting it through the different like undergraduate, graduate, and faculty student senates. But we just didn't think it was going to happen because of how resistant they were. And so we had to turn to other forms of action to make our change. But before we talk about that, we want to do a quick little like myth busting game. There were a lot of things that we were told, like reasons why we shouldn't decarbonize faster. And so we want to tell you all those reasons, and then, see maybe whether they're myths or not. I don't know.
Okay, let's do this. Y'all been sitting still for too long. So wiggle, shake around a little bit. This game is simple. It's a game I like to call Climate Mythbusters. I'm going to give you a statement. If you think it's true, you'll raise your hand. If you think it's false, you'll raise your hand. If the screen thinks he can put up with us a little longer, he'll raise his hand. First statement: despite UW's power plant, UW is operating at net zero carbon emissions. If you're an optimist and you think that's true, raise your hand. If you think this is a myth, raise your hand. That is right. Unfortunately, this is still a myth, so we're going to bust it together. Let's look at some data. That kind of speaks for itself. UW Seattle is in charge of the majority of UW's collective emissions, and that power plant puts out the majority of Seattle's emissions. So if we can change the power plant to the heat pumps, we're going to make a huge cut into those emissions immediately. Second statement, it gets harder. If we fund this amazing decarb plan, we're not going to have enough money to spend on other important things for students and staff. If you think that's a myth, raise your hand. That's right, this is a myth. The reason why is because we've done projects like this before. UW is massive. They have a huge capital budget. So when we fund this project out for the number of years we're going to be working on it, the budget is way smaller than other major projects we've taken on before. Additionally, you've heard about the CCA, the IRA. That funding dries up in about 10 years. And we don't get the funding if the project isn't done that we want to use the funding for. So the sooner we act, the more funds we're going to unlock from them. Additionally, you've heard that the like boilers and stuff are wearing out. We're going to have to replace them soon anyway, so we might as well invest now in getting those heat pumps. I was shocked to learn that because of the carbon cap situation in Washington, currently UW pays $5.2 million a year just for the right to pollute. By 2029, we're going to be paying $15 million a year just for the right to pollute. That money goes away. We never see it again. So we've got that. We pay $9 million a year to buy the natural gas that we're burning. So you can clearly see these things are starting to add up. And again, David Woodson, who we're honored to have in the room with us, has said that he doesn't think funding is going to be the biggest barrier to this project. Next statement. We need to wait for better technology before we can completely decarbonize. If you think that's a myth, raise those hands. That's right. Let's bust it. The director and associate director here at UW's Clean Energy Institute have recognized that this goal of 95% decarb by the year 2035 is totally possible with today's available technology. However, what about the timeline? Just because we have the technology doesn't mean we have the time to get it done. Clearly, we need way more time for construction. We're already constructing and building as fast as we can. If you think that's a myth, raise those hands. That's right. That's a myth. And the reason is because the vice president of UW's facilities has challenged Dave and the consulting team to get this done in 7 or 8 years instead of the 10-year timeline. So to get this done in 11 or 12 years should be a piece of cake. To that we say, yippee. Here's the last one. Students have no reason to care about this. And even if they did, they can't actually change anything. You know that's a myth. And the reason why, we've got some great reasons why coming right up here and pass it on. Thanks, guys.
Wait, which one goes where? So proof of that students do care is some of our the direct action that we've taken. When we came up with our strategy to push UW Board of Regents and President Casse to decarbonize faster, we thought about the different things that they would care about. First of all, faculty opinion, but maybe they don't really care about that as much as making money. But we are broke college students, so that is not the path that we chose. Instead, we chose to mess up UW's public image because UW loves to pretend that they are super environmental friendly and everything, but clearly they are not. So yeah.
Yeah, so as Amber said, we decided to target UW's public image in our action. And to do this, we decided to do a march and then a chain-in. So we did a march where we walked around campus doing chants, trying to kind of get a little bit of breakfast, a little bit of a scene around campus. And then we ended our march at the power plant where we read our demands and then chained ourselves to the smokestack for 3 days. And then after 3 days, we moved to Suzzallo to get more foot traffic, chained ourselves to the outside of Suzzallo. And we decided to do this for over a long period of time, over 5 days, to get more attention and get more people thinking about what they can do to help and why this is such a big issue.
And nights too. We slept on that. Oh, sorry.
We also, can I have that one? Yeah, okay. We also staged a die-in. So if you don't know what a die-in is, it's a form of protest in which protesters pretend to be dead in order to illustrate the point that they're making. And we did this at the June 2023 Board of Regents meeting. So in our case, as you heard earlier, the UW power plant emissions kill 20 people a year through heat-related deaths. So we decided to bring that image and that statistic to the Board of Regents themselves. So we got 22 people to agree to pretend to be dead in front of the Board of Regents meeting. We made signs illustrating how someone might die from the UW power plant. And we just created this really powerful image to illustrate to the Board of Regents and students and the broader community about how deeply important this is.
Yeah, so both of these actions, the chain-in and the die-in, were to affect UW's public image, get more attention, get people thinking about this. And to do this, we had to make sure that we were getting people's to look at what we're doing. And to do this, we did a lot of social media work. So we made sure that people knew what was happening, why we were doing it, and keeping them updated on the effects of this. And then we also reached out to different news outlets, getting the word out to people in the general public, not just at UW. So we got a story in the New York, or not the New York Times, bro, the Seattle Times. That would be cool if it was New York Times. Yeah, in the Seattle Times, about the chain-in, which was awesome. And also we wanted to make sure that both of our actions had very powerful imagery. So like Iris said, the die-in, having people pretend to be dead has a very powerful image. It gets in people's minds, gets them thinking about the extremity of this issue. And also having people chain themselves to a giant green smokestack is a very powerful image and also gets people thinking about it.
So what happened is, first of all, after we chained ourselves, the power plant, we got the attention of CASE and the Board of Regents, and we had a meeting with CASE. And at first, she did tell us she does not do demands, and because UW is not a democracy. But over time, we did see a very big change that we do believe is very much due to our actions. We saw the UW admin educate themselves. They're much more knowledgeable on this issue now than they were before we did all of these actions. Now we are also working on resolutions in ASUW, GPSS, and the Faculty Senate. And 2 of those have already passed. One just passed the GPSS passed, and then earlier today, it just passed in the Faculty Senate, where they all push for 95 by 2035.
Student action does make change. We've been doing that. Yeah.
But yeah, so this is the decarbonization plan that is still on the website of UW Sustainability. And this is the 2050 plan that we are trying to get rid of. We want it to be done by 2035. We have been told now that this is outdated, but it has not been officially updated. We need a official commitment to 2035.
Okay, cool. So thank you. So now if you're thinking about where can you work on a project that can help reduce UW's carbon emissions, the answer to all your qualms is UW Solar. So UW Solar is a vertically integrated project, which is a fancy word of saying that undergrads, grads, and other professionals all work together on long-term collaborative projects. It's a really fancy word. And then we're also an RSO. So since 2012 under Jan Whittington, students have been dedicated in designing, developing, and planning solar projects. And then some of the ones that you may or may not be familiar with are the Mercer Court student apartments, and then the Life Sciences building, which have rooftop solar or the PV system, or the photovoltaic fins on the Life Sciences building. So there's kind of some pathways into how students might get involved with UW Solar. So one of the ways is that someone can come to our group and be like, hey, I'm interested in doing this solar project. An example of that would be the Resiliency Tunnel. The Resiliency Tunnel got the class Campus Sustainability Fund last year, and it was started by an environmental science senior who was interested in creating sustainable food production on the UW farm for year round. And then another example of what we do, someone might come to us and be like, hey, can you redesign this solar project for us? So the Menashe Ridge Observatory is an example of that. So UW Astronomy reached out to us and said, hey, can you guys redesign this solar panel placement that we have out in Eastern Washington? And the solar serves as a backup energy source in cases of extreme weather. So they have a lot of expensive, fancy telescopes and other equipment out there. And then lastly, we have the e-bike charging station, which is a charging station behind Mary Gates Hall. And right now it's in process with UW facilities to finalize plans. Okay, and then a little bit more of what we actually do. So we do site evaluations and shading analysis. We do this through using Google Maps, Helioscope, and other tools. We do preliminary designs. We do cost estimations and financial modeling, which might look like thinking about what kind of construction materials we might need, what's the cost of solar, how much money are we going to save in the long run, et cetera. We look at policy. We work on grant writing, which is one of our big things right now. We go through the design review board, and then hopefully at the end we can talk to contractors and actually get our solar projects commissioned. Oh, and I love this quote. The work of UW Solar has resulted in the complete installation of more than 90% of UW Solar's solar assets, or University of Washington solar assets. It's pretty cool. Okay, and then how does this fit into UW's bigger role of decarbonization? So UW Solar has our own campus solar plan, which is an extension of the master solar plan. And under this, it's one of the action items in the sustainability action plan that says we're going to reduce 95 by 35 now after today. And what we did was we used since this club has began, we've used process to screen, analyze, and determine what are our physical assets on campus for both parking lots and for rooftop buildings. And since 2019 per kilowatt hour, it's going to be cheaper to invest in a solar project rather than buy power from Seattle City Light if that project has a guaranteed lifespan of 25 years. So that's a huge thing to think about in the long run. Okay, and then this is also where UW Solar comes in. So right now we're working on completing over 60+ grant proposals for both parking lots and for rooftop building structures or solar installations. So what this kind of looks like is, don't bother reading this because it's really small and it's only 2 of 4 pages of a grant proposal. But what we do is we summarize the project, we talk about the building, and then we go into our master data set and we create those tables on the sides that talk about what's the solar, is the building ready, et cetera, et cetera. This is a building, this is Packard Hall, but we also have a bunch for all the other buildings and for parking lot spaces. And we also go through and we look at this thing called NIST financial measurements, which is just a fancy thing that comes out of another fancy financial model that we use. But it basically says like, how much money are you going to save over time, like, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and then another deeper example into that. So this is the E18 canopy lot or canopy solar project on the E18 lot. And originally it was a solar project that includes both the E1 and the E18 lot, which it can be seen in the back here. And then since being picked up by UW Transportation, it's now more focused on putting a solar canopy on top of the E18 lot specifically. So right now this E18 canopy team is in process of doing a per quote with UW Transportation. And what that means is we're helping on the grant writing for this proposal. The next rooftop assessment. So this map is a little outdated. The colors are kind of ugly, but you kind of get the idea of it. Buildings are ranked A through D. An A ranking, we have about 53 buildings at UW. This means that there's ample sunlight, there's no mechanical obstructions on the roof, and the building was constructed after 1990, which makes it a good candidate for solar. And then our B ranked buildings, about 120 buildings at UW. The only difference between them is that this building was constructed before 1990. So the roof might need a little bit more help implementing solar, basically. And then besides that, something else that I didn't know is that rooftops need replacements. You can replace roofs. So if we can get this timeline of when buildings were constructed and when they need a roof replacement with solar installation, then it's a very good timeline for us. Oh, and then, yeah, that's not it from me. So we're going to be working on grant proposals for the following quarters. It's a big deal in actually getting something implemented on campus. And if you'd like to join UW Solar or just kind of talk to people, we're having a fun Valentine's Day meeting on Wednesday, February 14th, 6 to 7 in Gould. Yeah.
Okay, I think before we go into this section, which is our last section, we can do some questions for any of the groups on technical questions. I would also like to point out all the aerial shots Gabriel took with his drone, so multi-talented. Any questions? We're getting, okay. Why? Where's the other one? It might just be off. Okay.
Hello?
No, here we are. Okay.
Really close.
Okay, so this is our last section. We're CSF. We're gonna give you some Justice Center sustainability. So, yeah, so I think one of the main things, and bringing it back to what we talked about in the very beginning, is all the works that being done, incredible. major wins, we also need to think beyond decarbonization. Our solutions for climate change do not stop with decarbonizing. So I want to reground us in what we know to be true is, as ICA so lovely put, fossil fuels are terrible. They're really bad for your health. They're really bad for the earth. We're also running out of them. And so we have to transition. Also, youth are the ones leading the transition to renewable energy, both on our campus and globally, also because we're the ones that have to deal with it. And third, the fight for our climate and Mother Earth are the same as the fight against systems of exploitation. It's important to celebrate our wins and strive for more. We each have power and agency to build a more sustainable future for ourselves and the generations after.
And especially when thinking about the future, I think from the way ICA illustrated the sort of perspective switch in UW, we know that transition is inevitable, specifically a green energy transition. However, justice is not. And especially as to what Tatiana said, as youth, as people sort of leading the fight against climate change, not only is it important for us to push institutions to change, but also to know what sort of questions to ask and what sort of things to keep a critical eye out for in terms of centering justice and whether or not institutions are making that a priority in their energy changes or transitions. So thinking about decarb in like a really, I guess, broad sense, we want to break down a little bit more about what exactly it does and does not do. Again, really want to reemphasize, it is a huge step in the right direction. It really deals with direct emissions and cleaning up what sort of energy infrastructure we already have. However, at the end of the day, it does not change the fundamentals or the foundations of our energy economy, specifically in that our energy economy remains extractive and oftentimes hand in hand with that exploitative. So to that point, decarb does not, like calling for decarb does not necessarily address issues of social inequity. Those are things that we have to be really intentional about. I know ICA talking about when we end up having to decarb, making sure accessibility, like redesigning an accessible campus is part of that. That's like one example of how to do that. And then this is like what is needed for decarb and also what are cited as barriers for decarbonization. The main thing we really want to illustrate with this is that these are all things that have been historically exploited or allow for the continued exploitation of not only the environment, but also people. And then that's all just to say that even in a green energy transition, exploitation can, and as we'll see in the next couple of slides, does continue to exist. Decarbonization renewables, again, do not automatically center justice. They can still perpetuate social inequality. And oftentimes thinking about the sort of accumulated capital that needs to be had in order to have a green energy transition, it's often a privilege that wealthy Western nations can pursue, especially those who have accumulated their wealth from a fossil fuel-based extractive industry. And just something about a green energy transition, just because we're moving away from fossil fuels does not mean that we're not extracting anymore. It's just what we are extracting that's changing. For batteries, for new tech, we need a lot of minerals and metals. And I think batteries are kind of the big example that have been around a lot in sort of popular media. And so this is all to say that, especially when we're pushing for climate change solutions and action, we really encourage everyone to keep the following questions in mind of who is being centered, who is left behind, and arguably the most importantly, who has to bear the burden of our energy transition.
Oh, no, it's back to me. Okay. So really to think about what goes into all the batteries that we're using. It's important when we're thinking about resources needed to construct things, what they are. So primarily lithium, cobalt, and nickel. And so we know that we need these things. The next question is, where do these things come from and who has them? So lithium is primarily found in Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, which is known as the lithium triangle. Cobalt is found in the DRC, and nickel is found in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Brazil. I know you don't need me to tell you that all of these areas are dealing with mass conflict that are brought by a lot of other nations in pursuit of what they have. So it's a little bit about the lithium triangle. It's this area. I don't know how this, okay. We're gonna imagine I have the laser pointer on, but it's in this triangle right here. It's in the Andean region, and they hold 75% of all lithium known to exist in the world. Increasing lithium demand has been skyrocketing as, you know, smartphones become more popular, electric cars, etc. The extraction method for this is very destructive, and it's important to note as well is you can kind of see in our back image, but a lot of these are salt plains, and so they're very water scarce. And as the demand for lithium is increasing, we're drilling deeper and deeper and deeper, and these are they're very pristine, but also like ecosystems that are fragile. And so the more that we dig, the harder it is for the water to be able to come up and be able to support all of the life that exists there, including the people. And so there's a huge lack of community involvement, and benefit is pretty much going to the companies that are stationing themselves there and going to corporations. And one thing that I do want to point out is we've already mined over 50% of all known lithium available. You also know we're at the beginning of our journey for decarbonizing. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, as the demand is going to increase exponentially in the upcoming years, what are we going to do when we don't have a renewable resource? And what are we going to do when we run out?
Moving on to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was that second bullet point a couple slides ago. We wanted to read this quote that really, I think, broadly illustrates the situation there with respect to an energy transition. With the electrification of the global energy system gathering momentum year after year, demand for cobalt has seen unprecedented growth. In 2021, the market grew by 22% and is expected to rise by 13% per year for at least the next 5 years. And this boom in demand has created an increase in a lot of mining operations, both legal and illegal. And associated with that is that Congo's cobalt boom has been subject to modern day slavery, human trafficking, and child labor. And that is all to say that these mining operations have extremely devastating negative impact on local ecosystems and people. A lot of mining projects forcibly displace locals and give them no option, basically, of where else to go. Beyond the coercive labor practices and the exploitation of child labor, people work for, I think the
$5 a day
Yeah.
for 12 hours a day.
Yes. And there's no labor regulation, there's no health regulation. This is a photo of one of the mining sites. And cobalt is very, very dangerous to be in close contact with. It increases your risk for a lot of really devastating health conditions. Some of them are asthma, but lung cancer as well. And beyond just relying on the exploitation or enabling the exploitation of people, these mining sites have also caused an extreme degradation of land and water, which creates a feedback loop of marginalization. This photo, you might think that the blue water looks pretty and that it's a nice color, but that's actually unregulated runoff from a cobalt mine. And when thinking about how dangerous cobalt is to come in contact with, basically no one can touch the water anymore. And more than that, when this contamination begins seeping into soil, it affects larger areas, larger ecosystems, and agriculture is now suffering, which then creates food insecurity. And as you can see, that loop just keeps going and going and going, especially as our demand increases. And so this is less on the extractive resources needed for a green transition side, but also with just renewables in general. Oftentimes people really tout them as like the end all be all of sustainability. And they are really, I mean, they're not based on fossil fuels. I don't want to undermine the fact that they are very important, but they can still perpetuate inequality. A lot of governments and organizations like to put renewables in places that they deem uninhabited, which has a lot of issues with sort of overlap with indigenous lands, especially nomadic peoples or people who might not be legally recognized by their governments and or not have legal protections for their lands. Some quick examples are that dams divert rivers, solar panels are put in like large open areas, same with wind turbines. And some specific examples with the Sami up in the Arctic, a lot of wind turbines are put, they're nomadic, are put within the pathways of their migration and also the migration of reindeer, which some communities traditionally herd, because that area is deemed as uninhabited. And more locally with the Sauk Seattle tribe, I think they've sued Seattle City Light 3 times for their hydroelectric dams, because even though they are supposed to, they do not have pathways for fish to go to their historic breeding grounds, I think. And so that has really disrupted their ability to practice subsistence fishing and support their own communities. So I know that's kind of a mood killer, but thinking about this, it's really important to take this criticism as sort of a pathway for hope and to think about, well, then how do we intentionally center justice? Taking a sort of two-pronged approach with policy and programming specifically, there needs to be change on both sides or action on both sides. On one hand, policymakers, powerful leaders at different institutions need to be working to enact policy or change that not only addresses climate change, but also social inequity. On the other side, community action needs to drive policy creation. Mobilization, organization, direct action, community building, these are all very important steps to creating the policy that we want to see. With the ultimate goal being that not only are we centering frontline communities in the creation of climate solutions, but also that ultimately we are giving them ownership and control and say over these solutions, because at the end of the day, who knows what needs to be done better than the people who are experiencing that change most devastatingly. I don't know what the word is.
And so, yeah, okay, sure. We want to do those things. What does that actually look like? I think at the most fundamental level, it's listening, it's building solidarity, and it's prioritizing community needs. We can't go into these situations and think that we understand exactly what is supposed to happen. And if we're going into community and we want to build a solar farm and they say, please don't do that here, these are all the reasons why, we have to listen and we have to accept an alternate solution. Some of the things that could look like that are parking lots, like UW Solar's doing, instead of unused natural land for solar farms, salmon restoration or hatcheries with hydroelectric dams. Also, there's been a lot of dams that have been removed in Washington state, and we're doing fine. And the tribes are doing really well. And so I think also, again, trying to challenge our preconceived notions of what the solutions must be. Also, electrifying public transit, not single occupancy vehicles. It's important that as we're thinking about the transition, knowing that we have a finite amount of resources, how do we increase access to the most amount of people, right? So if we're trying to do mass transit, we're trying to do more walkable communities, if we're trying to do solar farms, how do you allow people to access that energy instead of it all being diverted to one individual, right? And at the bottom, it's really this lesson of like regeneration, not extraction. The good thing is that if we've mined over half of everything, like there's a lot for us to be able to pull on. I'm sure you also saw like the interview with Apple in response to the children mining in Congo. And he said, well, all of our stuff is recycled. So they've already mined so much that now their entire stream is regenerative because they don't have to get anything new. Also being in the United States, we've already mined a lot too. So it's some opportunities there. And so Court is going to bring us into our next section.
Okay. Wonderful job for all of our other speakers. I am going to kind of round this out before food and conversations at tables. Okay, so what can we do? And I think the biggest takeaway that I think I'm taking from ICA and UW Solar and all these other groups that are in this room is that it is so important to stay engaged and educated. I believe that gaining knowledge, gaining collective action, and being able to build that community base for engagement is one of the ways that we have been able to see the most student change here at UW and that we will continue to see in the greater Seattle area. So what does that look like? That looks like connecting with communities, organizations, and working in your area. And we've seen there are so many organizations, even on the UW Seattle campus, greater Seattle area, attending local events like teach-ins, joining mutual aid networks such as the Seattle Food Not Bombs group. And really important is staying informed. As we've seen in the past few months, that there is a really important focus on staying informed, but not just from our big media sources, because our big media sources are not telling us the full picture. So getting information from local organizations, advocacy groups, and localized media sources. Engaging in collective action, building and leaning into community for strength, hope, and justice. Because when we are constantly taking in news about what is happening around us, it is really easy to feel super discouraged because there's a lot going on. But being able to lean into our community groups and the people around us and being able to learn from one another is really, I think, where we are going to find the most amount of hope and momentum for change. So as the slide says, know your power and grow it. That is just the way that we are going to be able to see a lot of change. All these wonderful speakers have curated a resource guide for this event. And so we will be sending that out afterwards with links, different information, and ways to get involved, whatever your kind of area, niche, and interests are. So where to show up this week? If you have been on Instagram, you may have seen some of these graphics, but these two are happening on Sunday and super close and nearby with JVP Seattle and Super UW, which is a group that is doing really cool, good work here on campus. So show up for their events. And also, I know Super UW is doing a show up for Palestine Bake Sale, and I believe the form closes tonight. And okay, so if anybody wants to take a second, we can also send this out on our Instagram. This is an event resource guide curated by all these wonderful people. A lot of good information and ways to learn more and stay in the loop of what's happening.
Yeah, the PowerPoint is also linked at the top of the resource guide, and then you'll have more articles to read about a lot of things that we talked about today.
Yes, perfect. Okay, and oops.
Whoa,
Okay.
the food's coming in, folks.
Okay, I will wrap this up super quick. At the CSF, we have been working on creating a resource guide this past year, really drawing in from community knowledge and understanding that a lot of people have, information and knowledge that we might not have, or, finding ways to learn from those around us rather than, creating our own guides and resources. So we have this linked. There's a lot of guides on kind of introductions to food sovereignty, intersectional environmentalism, indigenous knowledge, with a bunch of mixed media sources about all these niches, and also from a variety of different authors, poets, scientists, researchers within the field. So definitely check that out. We have made some new ones related to what Bibi and Tatiana were talking about resource extraction in the Congo, Palestinian occupation, and climate justice. So definitely check those out. There's some really cool videos and films and zines, and I think just being able to consume media, I think, is really a great way to learn and also to really just stay informed and stay hopeful about the future. And this is a short little plug. We just recently published a zine. There's some people in the room that their work is actually in this zine. So this features a lot of projects that have been done on campus, a lot of people's beautiful poetry, art, really exploring the connections between storytelling, art, and community, and how all those three intersect for climate justice, environmental justice, for envisioning a more just and equitable future. So check that out, and I will pass this back to Tatiana.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay, one quick thing I will say about staying informed is, as EPSA talked about for the Climate Commitment Act, it's a very impactful piece of legislation. On November, it's going to go on the ballot. We have a guy that runs a hedge fund, and he's invested $6 million of his own personal dollars to try to repeal the Climate Commitment Act because he doesn't like it. So we need to vote no, and we need to keep it. And so just letting you all know, I know we all vote. And second part of that is a lot of people in power are getting old. Our time is now. And so these are some internships and institutes that are specifically like hoping that it will train you to be able to take these positions and really lead the change of the future. The first one is the Junior Summer Institute, which is available to seniors and their undergrad here, and it's through the Evans School. The second one is the Earth Lab Summer Internship EJ Scholars Program. I have some flyers on that table for y'all, and they have their first virtual info session on Valentine's Day. And then the last one is with an amazing community organization named Puget Sound Sage, and they do so much incredible work within Seattle, and this is a Community Leadership Institute. The program manager of that is on Zoom, but I'm also happy to chat about that after if anyone has questions. This is like a 6-month fellowship program to learn all the ins and outs of government and how do we actually make change and you know, play the inside-outside game, organize a little bit, start making policy changes, etc. And then, yeah, I think those are all our resources, and we can have questions for presenters. Thank you so much for sitting through all of this and learning with us.
Okay, do we have any questions?
Actually pretty good on time.
Once we'll get you guys your food. Yeah. What kind of accessibility changes do you plan on making to campus? Okay, so I will say like I'm not an expert in like accessibility issues. I don't have specifics for you. All I know is that like we really want to see work being done and like thought being put into it by people who are experts in that. Given that we're going like a bunch of the pathways are gonna have to be up and rebuilt. So yeah, I don't have like specifics for you. But basically we just wanted to create a space for that conversation to be had. And make sure it wasn't like forgotten and we just like rebuilt the same way, because I know there are a lot of accessibility issues with like just lots of stairs and all that kind of thing. Yeah.
And for that campaign, we were in contact with the disability groups on campus. So they would know more about that, but yeah, just to add that.
Not happening yet, we still get to decide.
Other questions?
For CFS, yes. Is CSF, yes. Is there ways you see the practicality of the intersection of decarbonizing UW and also keeping like a environmental justice framework? I know you like kind of mentioned some stuff. I was wondering if like you guys had any other ideas that were specific to UW.
For like specifically, I don't know if I need a mic for the audio. Okay, so question is like specifically what could we be doing here to implement more environmental justice? I honestly think we're doing a really good job, and I think that's because like for us, it's a very localized example, and you can, I think, see in the room, there's a lot of student power in the room. And so I think like on our campus, we're fortunate to be in a more progressive area where organizing is seen as like, okay. And I think that, you know, if we were in a different, maybe if we were in a different part of the state, it would look differently, right? Like I'm originally from Virginia, and the types of things that you advocate for are different. So being here in Seattle, I think there's a lot more focus, of course, on Indigenous sovereignty and tribes. And one of the parts about the decarbonization plan is with the heating and cooling water pump, a lot of it's going to be coming from Lake Washington, which we've been having a lot of issues with the salmon runs and the vitality because the Mountain Lake Cut is getting really, really hot and they're dying. And a lot of the tribes have actually, the last 2 summers, had to basically retrieve the salmon before they enter the cut and put them on a truck and literally drive them so that they don't die in the passageway. And so part of what we can do here as students is to advocate, which it's already happening. I know Dave is here, but we're already looking at having conversations with tribes locally that, you know, depend on these food systems for both cultural preservation and also just sustenance. And so making sure that those things, this is why it's also important to know what questions to ask, to know that this is something we should be fighting for. And yeah, I think especially around like disability justice, around the redesign of campus, we have a lot of really good circular systems too, like a lot of what Casey talked about with UW Solar and the farm. Like a lot of what is going in is like an input is also an output. So many of their projects are connected. Yeah, long answer. Thank you.
Okay, just kind of curious if y'all, any of the groups really, have like been in contact with other schools around the state or like done anything, I guess, yeah, to try to like reach out, or if there's like interest in that, I guess, also.
Yeah.
We haven't really. Definitely like there's interest in it. I know we like went and talked to like a class of students at Western, but that was more like just us telling what we'd done and less of like a collaboration. Um, yeah, I guess we were kind of focusing on like there's a lot of work to do just here at UW. But things are like going pretty well. So maybe we'll like yeah, expand our horizons. Yeah.
In that decarbonization plan, that's either by 2035 or 2050, like to get down to that goal of 95% decarbonization, is it mostly just in that like heating water situation, or is it, I don't know, like, because we were just talking so much about like the impacts of like electrifying as a form of decarbonization. And so I'm just like curious how much of the UW decarbonization plan is like what it's coming from, you know?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I won't like go into it all. There's definitely a lot of good resources that I can point you to. But part of the plan is like energy efficiency upgrades, because we will be like, obviously, if we switch to using heat pumps, we're going to be requiring more electricity from that, and we don't want to like, we want to try and increase our electricity usage as little as possible. Also using like energy storage, so that we can use electricity in like the off hours, like at night when less people are up and doing things, and then store it and use it during the day, those kind of things. Does that answer your question? Yeah. And then also like the power plant is 87% of our scope 1 emissions. So there'd be other work with like UW transportation and other things like future emissions to get us to the 95%. Yeah, yeah, back there.
Yeah, between all your groups, has there been any like thought, discussions or efforts towards like changing the campus food system to combat
A change in what?
the campus food system?
Food system?
Yeah, like switching away from like animal products to fight climate change and environmental harm.
Yeah, I know there has been thought about that by people at UW. Right now we've more been focusing on only like scope 1 emissions. But definitely like as that gets more kind of like underway and we're more like happy with the direction that that's going, there would be space to switch to like scope 3 emissions, which is like the food that we eat and all of that. Yeah.
So for food systems, at least with, sorry, I'm gonna stand in room. At least with UW Solar, we work a lot with the UW Farm. I think that's one of our biggest things in terms of local and on campus. I don't even think this is working, but to actually, like if you actually want to get involved in this, like hands-on, go to the farm, go volunteer with the farm. They're our main source of local food production, to be honest. And they're working on tons of projects right now. Like the farm manager, Perry, she's awesome. She wants to have like an apple orchard, like the resiliency tunnel. That's kind of hit a downfall, to be honest, because it was like a 1 million cost estimation. But it's something that's like, these are all projects that are long-term. They're all works in progress. They might not happen while you're at campus, but if you become involved and like are interested in food systems, I think that's a really great place to start.
I just also wanted to add that they're currently like in the works. It's a sustainable food systems club being started on campus, being registered as an official so that has outside funding. So if you're interested in that and interested in campus change around food systems, come talk to me afterwards. Like there's stuff happening. Then do it.
Yeah. Wait, could I go back to the, there was a previous question about working with other schools. I just want to add, we do ICA, works with Fossil Free U, which is kind of like a coalition of a bunch of all over the university that want to decarbonize and cut ties with fossil fuels. Which by the way also means like cutting ties with fossil fuels in the terms of research and investing money in fossil fuels and stuff like that. But yeah, so we have worked with them and taken up actions that they've done it on like a national type scale.
So I just wanted to say thank you again for the work that you do, the presentation that you put on for us. I really appreciate how it was very like factual and it was focused on important priorities. I didn't notice anything around politics or dogma or things like that. And so I was curious about what you think like the role of perhaps the private sector, the public sector, and the social sector, in the context of us being students at a public university, like what is our role to play in implementing perhaps some of these non-market solutions and really being very like bold in your approaches to resisting like temptation to politicize things, right? And how can you use that focus to also leverage the strength of our diversity as the next generation to accomplish these collective goals?
That EPSA, anyone want to go? Or? Thank you for your question. To summarize, it was kind of like, how do we look at non-market solutions and try to look at collaboration between the social, private, and public sectors? Yeah, and celebrate our diversity? Okay. So I think like the Climate Commitment Act is maybe a good example where it's like a market-based solution. So we're still looking at cap and trade, which means that you're still able to buy your way to trade, which means that as we're restricting the quantities of units that you're able to purchase, at the end of the day, it's going to be people who have the most resources that are going to be able to keep buying it, and they're going to be the last ones polluting, which is not very equitable. But the Climate Commitment Act has done a lot of amazing things in terms of the revenue that they've been able to generate. A lot of it's been going to tribes. The Quinault tribe in the Olympic National Forest in Western Washington has been facing displacement. And so the money from the CCA is actually going to pay to relocate the tribe to a safe place as they're dealing with, all of the unfortunate effects of climate change. I think like being in a public institution and being in just generally like in the public sector, we can show models and strive for models that really try to prioritize our collective well-being and, try to have more shared resources. So, as we're building more solar, looking at what areas around the university district maybe could benefit, like there's a concept called energy democracy, which is there's a lot of certain credits that, incentivize households in Washington State and Seattle it's cheaper, if you're of a certain income that you're able to then get solar panels on your house. Not everyone owns a home. I think most of us don't own homes. And so thinking about how can create like more common goods where maybe a neighborhood collectively owns a solar section together and they can all reap the benefits, because if you have solar, your utilities are cheaper. And so I think trying to think of those things, and I would say like, if the private market wants to, help and invest money, that's great. I think also private market's always seen as the one for innovation, but there's also sometimes with innovation, like whether like you have to question whether or not the pursuits are sustainable and if it's being done to do something that's cool or if it's being done to do something to benefit many people. These are my personal opinions, by the way. But yeah, that would be my answer. Thanks. Yes, I think we want to do a few more questions and then, okay, cool.
I have a question about transportation, and I saw one of the things on the slides was encouraging electrification of public transportation rather than like single car or like, yeah, individual cars. And I think that is kind of a question that is getting into lifestyle changes in general, and also how do you get people, it's very easy to electrify. Okay, sorry, not very easy, but it's gonna be a lot simpler to electrify public transportation in big cities rather than more suburban or rural areas. So first question is, how do you encourage lifestyle changes like that is gonna have to spend like the whole nation, as well as address issues that are not just concentrated in the city?
Is that me again?
You
may go first.
Okay. Okay, so I am obviously not an expert in this, but I think as like one of the little lessons of today's teaching, like the people, there's like a lot of power in groups and collective action. And I mean, first of all, like you have to build the infrastructure so that public transportation is like actually a way that people want to get around and isn't like super unreliable and it's going to be late and whatever. So first you have to provide people with like the good public transportation that will actually be useful to them. And then it really comes with just like some people got to start using it, and like you have to, maybe you're going to be the one who is like kind of the trendsetter in that respect. But I think like the youth kind of have to lead that charge in a way.
Yeah, make public transit cool. I think, yeah. I mean, one of the examples is King County Metro is working on electrifying their entire fleet. And this is where, again, like this community voice part comes in, is they were trying to figure out a pilot because it was expensive and they wanted to see where they were going to put it. And all of their research said that the area that would benefit the most is South Seattle. And then, you had many community members from Bellevue saying that they want actually to have the first electric buses be in Bellevue because they think that it's quieter and it will be really nice. And so community members were able to emerge and also point to all of the evidence saying that it would have the most impact on South Seattle, which when you think about like in our current society, who's using public transit, it's typically people who don't have a lot of money and are relying on these systems. They're also going to be the first people that are displaced from a city as rents are increasing. And so I think it's starting to think about that web of how do we keep people that are using public transit within the areas? Because when you're displaced from a city, people are having to buy cars, so they're able to come back into Seattle to work. Also, yeah, like trying to have a cultural change so that more people take the bus and, have the demand, and it's a service that we get to keep. Okay, I think time for dinner. And what I want to say first is these are some Instagrams to follow. These are some people on campus groups and then also off campus groups that have a lot of really good content. And there are questions on each table, which you're welcome to write on sticky notes. We have them up there on big things. And that's kind of like for reflections for today. And lastly, I want to celebrate who's in the room with us. This is such an amazing opportunity. And there are so many people that are here. And we want to celebrate that and celebrate the knowledge and power in this room. So we kind of messed up because we don't have enough name tags. So we're going to have to, do a little bit of yelling at each other and trying to see who's who. But they're all here. They're all here to talk. They're all here to, share resources and get connected and get you all connected to the work happening on campus. So thank you so much.